So we're carrying on looking at the big story of God, because when you know the big story, you can find your place in it much easier. For the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at, in more depth, the story of Jacob and his family. This family, if you think it's already been crazy with Jacob, is going to get a whole load more bonkers. You wouldn't make it up. In fact, you couldn't make it up. If you thought about making this story up, you'd make it a little bit more tame at points. The stuff that happens over the next few weeks is going to blow your mind, but it's all part of the story, and so we want to know it. It's about Jacob. You remember Jacob. We know some things about him already. He came out of the womb literally wrestling with his brother, the hairy hunter Esau. He then tricked and manipulated his brother into giving him all the inheritance and his birthright in return for a stew. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, he sticked some goat hair to the back of his neck and tricked his elderly, blind, dying dad into blessing him instead of the blessing that was due to his older, hairy hunter brother Esau. And then, because his older brother has had enough now with all this manipulation and deception, he scarpered, legged it, pegged it as quick as he could before Esau, who's really good at killing stuff, remember, could get hold of him. That's where we left the story last week. Jacob is now running way out of town, over the desert, to find his uncle. He's never met his uncle Laban. He's been told by his mum, go there, and when you get there, tell him who you are, tell him you're a relative, tell him you're my boy, and say to him that you've arrived there looking for a wife. So Jacob goes on this journey, and one day, having travelled across the sandy dunes for a bit, he arrives at a well. The well is surrounded by a few shepherds and their sheep. He says to these guys, he hasn't seen anybody for a few days, he says, guys, I'm from out of town. I'm looking for the home of a guy named Laban. Do you know Laban? They're all like, no way, we know Laban. Laban, yeah, he's a cool fella. In fact, they point over into the distance, just coming over the hill. In fact, over there, look, that's his daughter, Rachel. She's a shepherdess. She's coming to the well now. Jacob takes one look at Rachel in the distance and he thinks, all my dreams have come true. This is brilliant. Home run. I've come here telling my uncle, I'm going to tell my uncle I need a wife, and here is somebody that would fit the bill. She looks beautiful. So he turns to all the other shepherds and he says, listen, fellas, could you scarper? Could you just get out of here? I'd like to have some alone time with this woman coming over the hill. And they say, no way. What we do is we wait until all the shepherds and the shepherdesses are here, and then we roll the stone off the well together and we water all the sheep. So he has to wait until that happens. And so Rachel comes to the well with all of her sheep, and then Jacob, in this macho show of strength to try and impress her, pushes off the stone all by himself and starts to water her sheep, to give her sheep a drink. She's like, what are you doing? He's like, I gotta tell you, I am a distant relative. Close enough that your uncle's going to look after me, but distant enough that we could get married. I'm a distant relative, and I've come here looking for a wife. And do you know what? Your dad is my uncle, but we've never met, and I'm hoping that I can come and live with you for a bit. And I was just wandering across the desert, and maybe God is smiling on us because I met these guys and they know you. And what are the odds of bumping into you at this well? He cries out and starts crying. She's like, this is amazing, actually. Why don't you come back? So she takes Jacob back to their house and introduces him to Laban. And Laban's like, hey, come here. You're my family. You are welcome to stay here. So Jacob stays there. After about a month, Laban takes him to one side and says, look, thanks so much. You've been working in the farm, you've been looking after the sheep, you've been doing the washing up, you've been helping out loads around here. All the other people that do this much work, I pay them. Just because you're family, you shouldn't have to do it for free. How much do you want? Name your price. Jacob says, I don't really want money, but what I do want is Rachel. I'd really love to marry her. So how about, here's the deal. In our culture, we normally have to pay a bride price. Well, listen, I haven't got any money. So how about I work for you for 7 years, and in return, I'll be able to get married to Rachel. Laban says, shake it there, buddy. We've got a deal. So for 7 years, Jacob gets up early and he takes the sheep out to pasture and he fights off wolves and lions at night and he sleeps around campfires and he washes the dishes and he tills the farm soil for 7 years in return for this lady's hand in marriage. After 7 years, an alarm goes off. Time's up, buddy. It's time for a wedding. And so they have a wedding. And weddings in those cultures at that time, it wasn't just a couple of hours and then a buffet. It was a couple of days and there were feasts and there were dancing and people would come from all over to see the unification of these two families. But Laban's got a trick up his sleeve. He has another daughter named Leah, and Leah is not the one that Jacob wants to marry. Jacob really wants to marry Rachel. He fancies Rachel. He thinks Rachel is beautiful. He doesn't have any time for Leah. But Leah is the eldest daughter. And remember the culture, and this is exactly the same as what we had with Jacob and his hairy hunter brother Esau. The elder comes first. And so Laban takes his elder daughter Leah and says to her, Leah, dress up as your sister. And then today, when the wedding happens, I'm going to marry you to Jacob. He'll never know because you'll be dressed up. And so she dresses up and she gets married to Jacob. And he doesn't know because she's dressed up. I mean, imagine that. The guy is literally there because he dressed up as his brother, stole the blessing and then scarpered. And now he himself, the ultimate deceiver, is being tricked by his uncle into marrying the wrong sister. The next morning, when he sees his new bride with the veil lifted off for the first time, he's like, what? What has happened here? I can't believe it. I'm supposed to be the tricker. And he runs in to see his uncle Laban. He's like, what have you done? I cannot believe you've done this. Laban says, chill out. Don't worry. You can marry my other daughter as well. Here's a little side note. Don't worry, we don't do that anymore, but they did it back then. Don't worry. You can marry my other daughter as well. Just give me another 7 years' work. And because he loves Rachel so much, because Rachel is the apple of his eye so much, because Rachel is the object of his affection so much, and that's important, remember that for future weeks, he does it for another 7 years. He works for Laban. And then he now has 2 wives. Rachel, who he really loves, and Leah, who he really doesn't. So how do you find yourself in that story? Do you know anybody who will do anything to get what they want? Have you ever been cheated out of something by somebody who was a liar or a deceiver or a manipulator? Have you been at the wrong end of a deal when somebody else has cheated you out of stuff? Do you know somebody who'll stop at nothing to win? What does that feel like to be at the other end of that? Here's a question. Can you notice any of that in you? Maybe it's just a little grain of it, but is there anything inside you that is prepared to trample on other people to get what you want? If there is, do you think the Spirit of Jesus would whisper anything to you about that? We're going to come back to Jacob next week as we carry on with the big story of God.